Behind the glittering facade of royal ceremonies lies a world where every gesture carries weight, every glance tells a story, and a single piece of jewelry can spark a crisis that threatens the very foundation of the monarchy. What happened at the annual Children's Trust Gala wasn't supposed to become public knowledge. Palace staff were sworn to secrecy, security footage was quietly erased, and official statements were carefully crafted to hide the truth. But sometimes, even the most carefully guarded royal secrets have a way of surfacing. The incident began with what seemed like an innocent choice of accessories. Queen Camilla, preparing for one of the year's most prestigious charity events, made a decision that would send shockwaves through the royal household and leave King Charles questioning everything he thought he knew about loyalty, respect, and the delicate balance of power within his own family. The sapphire and diamond necklace had been Catherine's signature piece for nearly a decade. A wedding gift from the late Queen Elizabeth, it had become synonymous with the Princess of Wales's elegant style and her position as the future queen consort. Every time Catherine wore it, photographers captured its brilliance, fashion magazines analyzed its significance, and the public associated it with the grace and dignity of the woman who would one day wear the crown. So when Camilla appeared at the gala wearing that exact necklace, the reaction was immediate, explosive, and utterly unprecedented in modern royal history. What followed was a night that palace insiders would later describe as the evening everything changed. Charles's reaction wasn't just surprise or disappointment. It was something far more profound and disturbing. For the first time since becoming king, he was forced to confront a truth that would shake his confidence in his own judgment and leave him questioning whether the woman he had fought so hard to make his queen truly understood what it meant to be part of the royal family. This is the story of that night, and the 3 days that followed when the British royal family faced one of its most serious internal crises in decades. It's a story of ambition, jealousy, miscalculation, and the price of crossing lines that should never be crossed. Most importantly, it's a story about what happens when personal desires clash with institutional expectations and how one woman's choice of jewelry nearly brought down the monarchy from within. The morning of the Children's Trust Gala dawned gray and drizzly over London, but inside Clarence's house, Queen Camilla was already planning what she hoped would be a triumphant evening. The annual charity event was one of the most photographed occasions on the royal calendar, attended by celebrities, politicians, and international dignitaries. More importantly, it would be broadcast live to millions of viewers worldwide, making it the perfect stage for what Camilla had been carefully orchestrating for months. She stood before her dressing room mirror, studying her reflection with the critical eye of someone who understood that every public appearance was a performance. At 76, Camilla had learned to use fashion and jewelry as tools of communication, sending subtle messages about her status, her confidence, and her place in the royal hierarchy. Tonight's message needed to be particularly clear. Her personal dresser, Margaret Whitfield, had laid out 3 potential jewelry sets on the velvet-lined tray. Each piece was magnificent in its own right, but Camilla's attention kept returning to the sapphire and diamond necklace that gleamed in the center. The necklace that everyone knew belonged to Catherine. "Your Majesty," Margaret said carefully, "perhaps the emerald set would be more suitable for this evening? The green would complement your gown beautifully, and the historical significance—" "No," Camilla interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that came with wearing a crown. "I want the sapphires." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the necklace. She had been dressing members of the royal family for over 20 years, and she had never seen a more dangerous decision being made with such casual determination. The sapphire necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of Catherine's position as the future queen. To wear it would be seen as either a grave mistake or a deliberate provocation. "Ma'am, I feel I should mention that this particular piece— I know exactly what this piece represents," Camilla said sharply. "And I know exactly why I'm wearing it tonight." The truth was that Camilla had been planning this moment for weeks. She had grown increasingly frustrated with the constant comparisons between herself and Catherine in the press. Every royal engagement seemed to become an opportunity for journalists to contrast the elegant, youthful Princess of Wales with the older, less photogenic queen. The coverage of Catherine's recent solo trip to Ireland had been particularly galling, with headlines praising her as the perfect future queen and noting how naturally she commanded respect and admiration. Camilla understood that she would never have Catherine's natural grace or her effortless charm with the public. But she had something that Catherine didn't yet possess, the crown. She was the queen now, not the queen in waiting, and it was time to remind everyone of that fact. The sapphire necklace would make her point better than any speech or statement ever could. As Margaret fastened the necklace around her throat, Camilla felt a surge of satisfaction. The weight of the jewels against her collarbone was substantial, reassuring. This was how a queen should feel: powerful, confident, unassailable. She had spent decades being overshadowed by Diana's memory and, then, by Catherine's popularity. Tonight, she would reclaim her rightful place at the center of the royal story. What Camilla didn't know was that Catherine had specifically requested that the necklace be kept at Clarence House for safekeeping while she was away on royal duties in Scotland. The Princess of Wales had been planning to wear it to the gala herself, continuing a tradition that had made the piece synonymous with her public image. When Catherine's private secretary called that afternoon to arrange for the necklace to be transported to Kensington Palace, she was told that it was already being prepared for the evening's event. "Prepared for what event?" asked Sarah Morrison, Catherine's longtime aide, confusion clear in her voice. "For Her Majesty the Queen to wear tonight, miss," came the uncomfortable reply from Clarence House staff. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just an awkward scheduling mix-up. This was unprecedented. In all her years working with the royal family, she had never heard of one member wearing another's signature piece without explicit permission. The breach of protocol was staggering, but more than that, it was a direct challenge to Catherine's status within the family. She immediately called Catherine in Scotland, where the princess was visiting a children's hospital in Edinburgh. Catherine was in the middle of reading to a group of young patients when her phone buzzed with an urgent message. She excused herself and stepped into a private corridor to take Sarah's call. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am, but we have a situation," Sarah began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. As Sarah explained what had happened, Catherine felt her face flush with embarrassment and fury. The necklace wasn't just expensive jewelry. It was a gift from Queen Elizabeth specifically meant to mark Catherine's role as a future queen. Elizabeth had presented it to her on her 5th wedding anniversary, along with a handwritten note explaining that it had been worn by previous princesses of Wales and should be considered part of Catherine's official regalia. "Are you certain about this?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "Completely certain, ma'am. Palace sources confirm that the Queen is planning to wear the necklace tonight." The staff at Clarence House seemed quite uncomfortable about it, but they're following orders. Catherine closed her eyes and leaned against the hospital wall. She could hear the children laughing in the room behind her, completely unaware that their future queen was facing one of the most challenging moments of her royal career. This wasn't just about a piece of jewelry. It was about respect, boundaries, and the unspoken rules that kept the royal family functioning. "What would you like me to do, ma'am?" Sarah asked. Catherine considered her options. She could call Charles directly, but that would force him to choose between his wife and his daughter-in-law in a very public way. She could issue a statement through the palace, but that would only draw attention to the conflict and create exactly the kind of drama the monarchy tried to avoid. Or she could say nothing and allow Camilla's provocation to go unanswered, which would be seen as weakness. "Do nothing for now," Catherine said finally. "Let's see how this plays out." But privately, Catherine was furious. She understood the game that Camilla was playing, and she knew exactly what message the Queen was trying to send. It was a power play designed to put the younger woman in her place and remind everyone that Camilla was now the senior royal lady. What Camilla had failed to consider was how Charles would react to seeing his wife wearing jewelry that belonged to his son's wife without permission. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Charles was reviewing his speech for the evening when his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, knocked on his study door. The king looked up from his papers, immediately sensing tension in his aide's expression. "Your Majesty, there's something you should be aware of before this evening's event," Sir Clive began carefully. As the situation was explained to him, Charles felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Throughout his relationship with Camilla, he had often found himself caught between his love for her and his obligations to the institution of monarchy. He had fought for years to gain acceptance for their marriage, enduring public criticism and family tension to make Camilla his queen. Now it seemed she was determined to test the limits of that hard-won acceptance. "Has Catherine been informed?" Charles asked. "Yes, sir. Her private secretary was notified when the jewelry was requested for tonight." Charles nodded grimly. He knew Catherine well enough to understand that she would be deeply hurt by this deliberate slight, but too well trained to make a public scene. That almost made it worse. Catherine's grace under pressure would only highlight Camilla's aggression by contrast. "Very well," Charles said finally. "We'll address this after the event." But Charles was already dreading the evening ahead. He knew that the moment Camilla appeared wearing that necklace, every photographer in the room would recognize its significance. The story would dominate headlines for days, casting both women in an unflattering light and raising uncomfortable questions about unity within the royal family. As evening approached, the atmosphere at Clarence House grew increasingly tense. Staff members moved through their duties with unusual quiet, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even the normally cheerful household dogs seemed subdued, as if they could feel the weight of impending drama. Camilla, however, appeared completely serene as she put the finishing touches on her appearance. The sapphire necklace caught the light beautifully, its deep blue stones creating an elegant contrast against her navy silk gown. She looked every inch a queen, which was exactly the effect she had hoped to achieve. As their car pulled up to the venue, Charles glanced at his wife and felt a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Camilla looked magnificent, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her choice of jewelry was about to create ripple effects that would be felt throughout the royal family for months to come. The first photographers began clicking their cameras the moment Camilla stepped out of the car, and Charles watched their faces change as they recognized the necklace. He could practically see the headlines writing themselves. "Queen Camilla claims Catherine's crown jewel," or "Royal Jewelry Drama. Who really rules the palace?" As they walked toward the entrance, Charles made a decision that would define the rest of the evening. Instead of offering his arm to Camilla as he normally would, he moved slightly ahead, creating just enough distance to send a clear message of his own. It was a subtle gesture that only the most experienced royal watchers would notice. But in the carefully choreographed world of monarchy, such signals spoke volumes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of Charles's reign and force everyone involved to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, respect, and the price of ambition within the royal family. The grand ballroom of the Royal Lancaster Hotel had been transformed into a glittering wonderland for the Children's Trust Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls lined with portraits of young beneficiaries, while tables adorned with white roses and gold accents created an atmosphere of understated elegance. The cream of British society mingled with international dignitaries, celebrities, and business leaders, all united in their support of the charity's mission to help disadvantaged children across the Commonwealth. As Charles and Camilla entered the ballroom, a hush fell over the assembled guests. The traditional protocol dictated that everyone would stand and acknowledge the royal couple's arrival. But tonight there was an unusual tension in the air. Experienced courtiers and royal correspondents immediately noticed the subtle distance between the king and queen, and more importantly, they noticed the necklace. James Morrison, royal correspondent for the Times, felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the sapphire and diamond piece adorning Camilla's throat. He had covered dozens of Catherine's appearances where she wore that exact necklace, and he understood immediately that something unprecedented was happening. His photographer, Maria Santos, was already adjusting her lens settings to capture every detail of what would undoubtedly become one of the most analyzed royal photos of the year. "This is extraordinary," James whispered to his colleague from the Daily Telegraph. "That's Catherine's signature necklace. I've never seen anything like this." Lady Pemberton, a longtime friend of the royal family and veteran of countless royal events, watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. She had known both Charles and Camilla for decades, and she could read the king's body language like a book. His jaw was set in a way that indicated barely controlled anger, while his usual warm greeting to familiar faces was replaced by a formal nod that kept everyone at arm's length. The charity's chairman, Sir David Hartwell, approached the royal couple with his usual enthusiasm, but even he seemed to sense the underlying tension. His brief for the evening had included detailed notes about which topics to avoid and which achievements to highlight, but nothing had prepared him for navigating what appeared to be a royal marital crisis playing out in public. "Your Majesties, welcome to our annual gala," Sir David said warmly. "We're so honored by your presence tonight. The Children's Hospital in Manchester that will benefit from tonight's fundraising efforts represents exactly the kind of transformative work that—" "Yes, quite," Charles interrupted, his tone more clipped than usual. "I trust the evening will proceed as planned." Camilla, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. She smiled graciously at the assembled guests, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the sapphire necklace as photographers captured every angle. She was experienced enough in royal protocol to understand that her choice of jewelry would be noticed and discussed, but she appeared completely unbothered by the attention. At table 12, positioned strategically where they could observe the royal couple throughout the evening, sat a group of Catherine's closest friends and supporters. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Catherine's friend since university, watched Camilla's performance with increasing indignation. "The audacity is breathtaking," she whispered to her dinner companion, the Duchess of Roxburghe. "That necklace was a personal gift from Queen Elizabeth to Catherine. It's not some communal piece that anyone can just decide to wear." The Duchess nodded grimly. "Charles looks absolutely furious. I've known him for 30 years, and I've never seen him this controlled in public when he's clearly angry. This is going to have serious consequences." As the evening progressed, the situation became increasingly uncomfortable. Charles delivered his speech about the importance of supporting vulnerable children with his usual eloquence, but those who knew him well could detect an underlying tension in his voice. When he mentioned the importance of respect and understanding within families, several guests exchanged meaningful glances. Camilla's response when called upon to address the gathering was equally revealing. Instead of the brief, gracious remarks that royal protocol typically demanded, she delivered an unexpectedly lengthy speech about her own charitable work and her evolution into the role of queen. The emphasis she placed on certain words made her meaning clear to anyone paying attention. "As queen, I understand the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing the crown," she said, her hand once again moving to the necklace. "Every choice we make, every piece we wear, every word we speak carries meaning beyond the personal. Tonight, I choose to honor the legacy of service while looking forward to the future of this great institution." The applause that followed was polite, but noticeably restrained. Several prominent guests, particularly those with close ties to Catherine, barely participated in the ovation. The tension in the room had become so palpable that even the typically enthusiastic charity supporters seemed subdued. Behind the scenes, palace staff were working frantically to manage the unfolding crisis. Sir Clive Alderton had been fielding calls from various royal households throughout the evening, trying to coordinate a response to what was clearly becoming a major story. Catherine's private secretary had called 3 times from Scotland, seeking guidance on whether the Princess of Wales should issue any kind of statement. The photographs are already being transmitted to news desks around the world, Sir Clive reported to his assistant. By tomorrow morning, this will be front-page news in every major newspaper from London to New York to Sydney. In the hotel's private communication center, royal press officers were monitoring social media and news websites in real time. The story was already trending on multiple platforms, with royal watchers and fashion enthusiasts dissecting every detail of Camilla's appearance and speculating about the implications of her jewelry choice. The public response is mixed, reported Press Secretary Amanda Richardson. Catherine's supporters are calling it disrespectful and inappropriate. Camilla's defenders are saying she has every right to wear any jewelry from the royal collection. But the overall tone suggests this is being seen as a significant breach of protocol. Meanwhile, at the high table, Charles found himself in the impossible position of trying to maintain royal dignity while processing his own complex emotions. He was genuinely angry about Camilla's decision, particularly because he knew it would hurt Catherine, who had always treated his wife with respect and kindness despite their complicated history. But he was also acutely aware that any public display of discord between him and Camilla would only make the situation worse. During the charity auction, which traditionally served as the evening's highlight, Charles bid aggressively on several items, his competitive spirit perhaps providing an outlet for his frustration. When a vintage emerald bracelet came up for auction, a piece that had belonged to his grandmother, he drove the bidding far beyond its estimated value, ultimately winning it for an astronomical sum. A generous gesture from His Majesty, the auctioneer announced, but those at the royal table noticed that Charles immediately handed the bracelet to Sir David rather than to Camilla, as would have been customary. As the evening drew to a close, the traditional receiving line formed, allowing guests to personally thank the royal couple for their attendance. This part of the event, usually a pleasant formality, became an exercise in diplomatic navigation as guests struggled to find appropriate words that wouldn't acknowledge the obvious tension. Dame Helen Mirren, attending as a patron of several children's charities, approached the royal couple with her characteristic poise. Her brief exchange with Charles was warm and natural, but when she turned to Camilla, her smile became noticeably more formal. "Your Majesty, you look absolutely radiant tonight," Dame Helen said diplomatically. "Thank you," Camilla replied. "I felt it was important to make a statement this evening about the continuity of the monarchy and the respect we owe to our predecessors." The comment was clearly intended to justify her choice of jewelry, but it only served to highlight the inappropriateness of the situation. Dame Helen simply nodded and moved on, but her expression suggested she understood exactly what kind of statement Camilla had actually made. Lord and Lady Ashworth, longtime family friends who had attended Charles and Diana's wedding and later supported him through his difficult years with Camilla, found themselves in a particularly awkward position. They genuinely cared about Charles's happiness, but they also recognized that tonight's events represented a serious miscalculation on Camilla's part. "Charles, wonderful speech tonight," Lord Ashworth said carefully. "The charity's work is truly inspiring." "Indeed," Charles replied, his tone giving nothing away, "though I suspect tonight will be remembered more for other reasons." It was perhaps the only moment all evening when Charles allowed his true feelings to show, even briefly. Lord Ashworth nodded sympathetically, understanding that his old friend was facing one of the most challenging situations of his reign. As the royal couple finally prepared to leave, the evening's damage was already becoming clear. Photographers had captured hundreds of images of Camilla wearing Catherine's necklace, and several had managed to photograph Charles's moments of obvious displeasure. The story was already being framed as either a bold assertion of Queen Camilla's authority or a serious breach of royal protocol, depending on the outlet's perspective. In the car ride back to Clarence House, Charles and Camilla sat in silence for the first 10 minutes. The usual post-event conversation about the evening's highlights and the people they had met was notably absent. Finally, Charles spoke. "I trust you achieved what you set out to achieve tonight," he said quietly. "I wore a beautiful necklace to a charity gala," Camilla replied defensively. "I'm not sure what you mean by that comment." "You know exactly what I mean." The rest of the journey passed in silence, but both Charles and Camilla understood that their relationship had shifted fundamentally that evening. The king had been forced to confront the reality that his wife's ambitions might not always align with his vision for the monarchy, while Camilla had learned that her position as queen did not grant her unlimited freedom to assert dominance over other family members. By the time their car pulled through the gates of Clarence House, news vans were already gathering outside. The palace press office had been inundated with requests for comment, and social media was buzzing with speculation about what the evening's events meant for the royal family's internal dynamics. The real consequences of Camilla's decision, however, were only just beginning to unfold. The morning after the gala dawned with a media storm that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions of the palace communications team. By 6 a.m., every major newspaper in Britain featured the story on their front pages, with photographs of Camilla wearing Catherine's necklace dominating the coverage. The headlines range from the relatively restrained royal jewelry controversy at Charity Gala in the Times to the more sensational Camilla's crown jewel power grab. In the sun inside Clarence House, Charles sat at his private study, nursing his second cup of tea while reviewing the coverage with growing dismay. The photographs were even more damaging than he had anticipated. Several images captured the exact moment when he had distanced himself from Camilla, creating a visual narrative of discord that would be impossible to explain away. Sir Clive Alderton entered with the latest batch of international coverage, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the story has been picked up globally. The New York Times is calling it the most significant breach of royal protocol in decades, and Le Figaro is describing it as evidence of deep divisions within the British monarchy." Charles set down his teacup with careful precision. And the palace's response? The communications team has prepared several draft statements, but frankly, sir, anything we say at this point will only draw more attention to the situation. The Princess of Wales's office has been bombarded with requests for comment, but they're maintaining complete silence on her instructions. The mention of Catherine only deepened Charles's sense of guilt and frustration. He had spoken to William briefly by phone that morning, and while his son had been diplomatically restrained in his comments, Charles could hear the anger beneath his carefully chosen words. William had simply said that Catherine was disappointed but not surprised by the evening's events, a response that somehow managed to be both gracious and devastating. Meanwhile, in the Queen's private apartments, Camilla was conducting her own damage assessment with the help of her personal staff. Her private secretary, Joy Cam, had been fielding calls since dawn from various members of the extended royal family, most of them expressing concern about the situation and seeking clarification about Camilla's intentions. The Duchess of Gloucester called to express her surprise at last night's events, Joy reported carefully, and Princess Anne's office has requested a meeting to discuss coordination of royal jewelry selections going forward. Camilla's jaw tightened. Anne's request was particularly galling because it represented exactly the kind of institutional oversight that Camilla had been trying to avoid. As the hardest-working member of the royal family, and someone with an impeccable understanding of protocol, Anne's intervention would carry significant weight with Charles. "Schedule the meeting," Camilla said finally, "but make it clear that I'm consulting with them as a courtesy, not because I require their permission for my wardrobe choices." The first major confrontation of the day came when Charles requested a private meeting with his wife in his study. The conversation that followed would later be described by palace sources as frank and difficult, though the exact details remained closely guarded. "Help me understand your thinking last night," Charles began, his tone carefully controlled. "Because I'm struggling to see how wearing Catherine's necklace served any constructive purpose." Camilla had clearly prepared for this conversation. "That necklace is part of the crown collection," she replied firmly. "As queen, I have every right to wear any piece I choose. If Catherine has developed a personal attachment to particular items, that's understandable, but it doesn't give her exclusive ownership. You know perfectly well that's not how this works," Charles responded, his voice rising slightly. "Royal jewelry isn't assigned randomly. Pieces develop associations with particular family members, and those associations are respected. The sapphire necklace has been Catherine's signature piece for nearly a decade, and maybe it's time for that to change." The bluntness of Camilla's response stunned Charles into momentary silence. He had expected her to offer some explanation that would allow them both to save face, perhaps claiming it had been a mistake or a misunderstanding with her dresser. Instead, she was doubling down on her decision and making it clear that this had been a deliberate power play. "This isn't just about a necklace, is it?" Charles asked quietly. "No, Camilla replied. It's about respect and recognition. I've spent 20 years being compared unfavorably to other women in this family. I've been patient, I've been understanding, and I've played by rules that were designed to diminish my importance. Last night, I reminded everyone that I am the queen now, not the queen in waiting." Charles stared at his wife, seeing perhaps for the first time the depth of resentment that had been building beneath her public facade of contentment. He understood her frustration. The constant comparisons to Diana and Catherine had been difficult for both of them, but he was appalled by her chosen method of addressing it. "And what about Catherine's feelings in all this?" he asked. "She has never been anything but supportive of you, despite having every reason to view you as a threat to her children's inheritance." "Catherine will survive having her jewelry borrowed for one evening," Camilla replied dismissively. "If she can't handle that level of competition, then perhaps she's not suited for royal life after all." The conversation continued for another hour, growing increasingly heated as both parties revealed frustrations that had been building for months. Charles accused Camilla of jeopardizing the stability of the monarchy for personal gain, while Camilla accused him of prioritizing his daughter-in-law's feelings over his wife's rightful authority. No resolution was reached, and both parties emerged from the meeting more entrenched in their positions than before. The situation became even more complicated when Catherine unexpectedly returned from Scotland that afternoon, cutting short her engagements to deal with the crisis personally. Her decision to come back early was itself a significant statement, as it demonstrated that she viewed the situation as serious enough to warrant immediate attention. Catherine's first stop was Kensington Palace, where she met with her senior staff to assess the situation and plan her response. Unlike the emotional reaction that many expected, Catherine approached the crisis with the cool professionalism that had made her one of the most respected members of the royal family. "The most important thing is that we don't escalate this into a larger conflict," she told her communications team. "Whatever Camilla's motivations were, we need to respond in a way that protects the institution and maintains dignity." Sarah Morrison, Catherine's private secretary, had prepared a detailed analysis of the media coverage and its potential long-term impact. "The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive of you, ma'am," she reported. "Social media sentiment is running about 80-20 in your favor, and several prominent royal correspondents have written pieces criticizing the Queen's decision as inappropriate." Catherine nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "That kind of public division is exactly what we need to avoid. If this becomes a popularity contest between me and Camilla, everyone loses." The afternoon's most significant development came when William arrived at Kensington Palace for a private meeting with his wife. Their conversation lasted over 2 hours, and while no official record was kept, palace sources later indicated that William was far less diplomatic in his assessment of Camilla's behavior than Catherine had been. "This was a deliberate provocation," William reportedly told his wife, "and it can't go unanswered. If we don't address this now, it establishes a precedent that Camilla can walk over anyone in the family whenever she feels insecure." Catherine, however, remained focused on finding a resolution that would minimize damage to the monarchy. "We need to be smarter than that," she argued. "If we respond aggressively, we look petty. If we handle this correctly, Camilla's behavior reflects poorly on her, not on us." The evening brought the first direct communication between the two women since the gala. Camilla called Catherine's private line at Kensington Palace, a conversation that lasted exactly 12 minutes and was described by those aware of it as cordial but cold. "I hope you understand that my choice of jewelry last night wasn't meant as a personal slight," Camilla began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Of course," Catherine replied evenly, "though I admit I was surprised to see the necklace. It wasn't what I expected for the evening. As queen, I felt it was appropriate to wear something that represented the continuity of the monarchy. I see. The conversation continued in this vein, with both women maintaining perfect politeness while making their positions crystal clear. Camilla attempted to frame her decision as a natural expression of her royal authority, while Catherine's responses made it clear that she viewed it as a breach of respect and protocol. The call ended with no resolution, and both women understanding that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the evening's events. Meanwhile, the broader royal family was grappling with the implications of the conflict. Princess Anne, as the most senior female member of the family after Camilla herself, found herself in the awkward position of being asked to mediate between the two women. Her solution was characteristically direct. She scheduled individual meetings with both Catherine and Camilla for the following day, with the intention of establishing clear guidelines for future jewelry selections. The Earl and Countess of Wessex, Edward and Sophie, were dealing with their own concerns about how the conflict might affect their children's positions within the family. Sophie, in particular, had developed a close relationship with Catherine over the years and was disturbed by what she saw as Camilla's unnecessary aggression. "It's just so pointless," Sophie confided to a friend that evening. "Catherine has never been anything but gracious to Camilla. Why pick this fight now, when the family finally seemed to be functioning well together?" By the end of the day, palace sources were describing the atmosphere within the royal household as tense and uncertain. The communications team was working around the clock to manage the media narrative, but they were fighting an uphill battle against a story that seemed to encapsulate every stereotype about royal family dysfunction. Charles, meanwhile, spent the evening alone in his study, reviewing documents and trying to understand how a charity gala had spiraled into the most serious internal crisis of his reign. He had worked so hard to establish his legitimacy as king and to gain acceptance for Camilla as his queen, only to see those achievements threatened by one evening's poor judgment. The most troubling aspect of the situation, from Charles's perspective, was the realization that this might not be an isolated incident. If Camilla was willing to provoke this level of conflict over a piece of jewelry, what other challenges to family harmony might be forthcoming? As the day ended, all parties involved understood that the real work of resolving the crisis would begin the next morning. The public attention had made it impossible to simply ignore what had happened, but finding a path forward that preserved relationships while maintaining institutional dignity would require unprecedented delicacy and skill. The crisis reached its climax on the third day following the gala, when Princess Anne arrived at Clarence's house for what palace insiders would later describe as the most consequential family meeting in recent royal history. Anne's reputation for plain speaking and her position as the most senior female royal after Camilla herself gave her unique authority to address the situation directly. Charles had specifically requested his sister's intervention after a sleepless night spent contemplating the potential long-term damage to the monarchy. The morning newspapers had been even more damaging than the previous day's coverage, with several prominent commentators questioning Camilla's suitability for the role of queen and calling for a more formal structure to prevent future conflicts. "The situation has moved beyond a simple disagreement about jewelry," Charles told, and as they met in his private study before Camilla joined them. "This is now about the fundamental question of how we function as a family and an institution." And nodded grimly. She had spent decades navigating the complex politics of royal life, and she understood better than most how quickly personal conflicts could escalate into institutional crises. "What's your assessment of Camilla's mindset? Is this likely to happen again?" Charles hesitated before answering. "I think she genuinely believes she was asserting legitimate authority as queen. The problem is that her understanding of that authority doesn't align with how the family has traditionally operated." When Camilla entered the study 15 minutes later, the atmosphere was immediately tense. She had clearly prepared for a difficult conversation, arriving with a folder of notes and wearing an expression of defiant determination that suggested she had no intention of apologizing for her actions. "And how lovely to see you," Camilla began with forced warmth. "Though I suspect this isn't a social call." "No," "It isn't," and replied with characteristic directness. "We need to discuss what happened the other evening and how we prevent similar situations in the future." What followed was a 90-minute conversation that touched on fundamental questions about royal hierarchy, family relationships, and the unwritten rules that had governed the monarchy for generations. Camilla maintained that her actions were entirely appropriate for a queen, while and Charles argued that royal authority had to be exercised within the context of family harmony and institutional stability. "The monarchy survives because we present a united front," and explained with the patience of someone who had spent 40 years in royal service. "When family members are seen to be in conflict, especially over something as symbolic as jewelry, it undermines public confidence in the entire institution." Camilla's response revealed the depth of her resentment toward the constraints of royal life. "I've spent decades being told to step back, to defer, to make myself smaller so that other people could shine," she said, her voice rising. "I thought that becoming queen would finally mean that my voice mattered and my choices were respected." "Your voice does matter," Charles interjected, "but it has to exist in harmony with other voices in the family. What you did the other night didn't assert your authority. It demonstrated that you're willing to damage family relationships for personal satisfaction." The conversation might have continued indefinitely without resolution if and hadn't proposed a concrete solution that addressed both the immediate crisis and the underlying tensions that had caused it. "Here's what's going to happen," and announced with the authority that came from being the hardest-working member of the royal family. "First, we're going to establish a formal system for coordinating jewelry selections for major events. No one wears anyone else's signature pieces without explicit permission. Second, we're going to have quarterly family meetings to address any concerns about roles, responsibilities, and protocol before they escalate into public conflicts." The proposal was both practical and diplomatic, providing a face-saving structure that acknowledged Camilla's concerns while establishing clear boundaries for future behavior. More importantly, it created a mechanism for preventing similar conflicts without requiring anyone to admit wrongdoing. Camilla's initial reaction was resistance. "I don't think we need formal procedures to govern what should be common courtesy and mutual respect," she argued. "The events of the past 3 days suggest otherwise," and replied simply. After another hour of discussion, all parties agreed to Anne's proposal, though the enthusiasm varied significantly. Charles was relieved to have a path forward that didn't require him to choose sides publicly between his wife and his daughter-in-law. Camilla accepted the arrangement reluctantly, recognizing that her isolation within the family made opposition futile. The next crucial step was addressing the situation with Catherine and William. That afternoon, Charles made the unprecedented decision to visit Kensington Palace personally to discuss the resolution with his son and daughter-in-law. The visit, conducted with minimal fanfare and maximum security, was Charles's way of demonstrating that he took their concerns seriously. Catherine received him in the informal sitting room where the family usually gathered for private conversations. William joined them, but remained standing throughout the meeting, a subtle indication of his continued anger about the situation. "I want you to know that I've addressed this matter directly with Camilla," Charles began. "What happened was unacceptable, and we've put measures in place to ensure it doesn't happen again." Catherine nodded graciously, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I appreciate your attention to this matter. The most important thing is that we move forward in a way that protects the family's unity." William was less diplomatic. "With respect, Father, this wasn't just a misunderstanding about jewelry. It was a deliberate attempt to embarrass Catherine and assert dominance within the family. The measures you've described are helpful, but they don't address the underlying attitude that created this problem." Charles found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending his wife's character while acknowledging the legitimacy of his son's concerns. "Camilla made a serious error in judgment," he said finally. "But I believe she understands now that such behavior is incompatible with her role as queen." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering not just the immediate crisis, but broader questions about family dynamics and the challenges of managing multiple strong personalities within the royal household. By the end, a fragile understanding had been reached, though deep wounds remained. Catherine's response to the situation would ultimately prove more effective than any formal agreement or family meeting. Rather than engaging in public recriminations or allowing herself to be drawn into a prolonged conflict, she chose to demonstrate her character through her actions in the weeks that followed. Her next major public appearance came at a children's hospital opening in Liverpool, where she wore a completely different set of jewelry, elegant pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana, and delivered a speech about the importance of grace under pressure and choosing kindness even when it's difficult. The subtle references to the recent controversy were clear to anyone paying attention, but Catherine's approach was so graceful that it only enhanced her reputation. Meanwhile, Camilla found herself increasingly isolated within both the family and the broader royal household. Staff members who had previously been neutral in their loyalties began to view her with suspicion, wondering what other unpredictable decisions might be forthcoming. Several prominent courtiers who had supported her elevation to queen began privately expressing doubts about her judgment and suitability for the role. The most significant long-term consequence of the incident was its impact on Charles's relationship with his wife. While they maintained their public partnership and continued to appear together at official events, sources close to the couple reported that their private relationship had been fundamentally altered by the crisis. Charles had spent years defending Camilla against critics who questioned her appropriateness as queen, and the jewelry incident forced him to confront the possibility that some of those critics might have been right about her character and judgment. The realization that his wife was capable of such calculated cruelty toward Catherine, someone who had always treated her with respect, deeply shook his confidence in his own judgment. In the months that followed, Charles began to rely more heavily on other family members for advice and support, particularly and the Earl of Wessex. His weekly meetings with William became longer and more frequent as he sought to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by the crisis. Camilla, for her part, seemed to recognize that her miscalculation had cost her significant influence within the family. Her public appearances became more carefully scripted, and she avoided any situation that might create controversy or draw unfavorable comparisons to other family members. The confident assertion of authority that had characterized her behavior at the gala was replaced by a more cautious approach that suggested she understood her position was now more precarious. The formal jewelry coordination system established by and proved to be remarkably effective, though it was less about preventing conflicts than about creating a structure that forced all parties to consider the broader implications of their choices. The quarterly family meetings also became a valuable forum for addressing tensions before they could escalate into public crises. Perhaps most importantly, the incident served as a wake-up call for the entire royal family about the fragility of their public image and the importance of maintaining unity in an age of intense media scrutiny. The 3 days of crisis coverage had demonstrated how quickly a personal disagreement could become a national story with serious implications for the monarchy's reputation. A year later, the sapphire and diamond necklace made its next public appearance at a state dinner honoring the President of France. Catherine wore it with her customary elegance, and the photos from that evening showed her laughing warmly with both Charles and Camilla, presenting an image of family harmony that had been carefully rebuilt over months of patient effort. But those closest to the family knew that the relationships had been permanently altered by those 3 days in November. Trust, once broken, is difficult to fully restore, and while the royal family had successfully weathered the crisis, the scars remained beneath the surface of their carefully maintained public facade. The incident ultimately served as a reminder that even the most privileged and powerful families are not immune to the basic human emotions of jealousy, resentment, and the desire for recognition. In the rarefied world of royalty, where every gesture carries symbolic weight and every relationship is scrutinized by millions, such emotions can have consequences far beyond their original intent. For Charles, the crisis marked a turning point in his reign. forcing him to develop new strategies for managing family dynamics while maintaining the dignity and stability that the monarchy required. For Catherine, it demonstrated the importance of grace under pressure and the power of responding to provocation with quiet dignity. And for Camilla, it served as a costly lesson in the difference between having authority and knowing how to use it wisely. The necklace itself remained a symbol of the complex relationships within the royal family, a beautiful object that had briefly become the focal point of much larger questions about power, respect, and the price of ambition within the most scrutinized family in the world.